Hi, I'm Eric Siegel with ericstrains.com. Today we're going to take a look at a really cool set. This is the newest rendition of the 3-rail O-scale New York Central 20th Century Limited Streamlined passenger set from MTH. Okay, so here we have a review for yet another famous train, the 20th Century Limited. So what I'm going to do is start things off with some history on the real 20th Century Limited, and then after that we'll get into the MTH rendition that you see here. So the 20th Century Limited was a passenger train operated by the New York Central between 1902 and 1967. It traveled between Grand Central Terminal in New York City and LaSalle Street Station in Chicago, and it ran along the New York Central's famous water level route. Now, because the 20th Century Limited was an express train, there were very few station stops along the route, and they often used track pans to take on water at speed to further reduce the number of needed stops. By the late 1930s, the 20th Century Limited was being run with streamlined equipment like you see here, and the 958-mile journey from New York to Chicago was made in just 15 hours, departing New York at 6 p.m. and arriving in Chicago at 9 a.m. the next morning. The 20th Century Limited was one of the premier passenger trains of the New York Central and was meant to compete with the high-end upper-class passenger trains of the Pennsy. In particular, it was meant to compete with the Pensy's Broadway Limited train. Now, part of that competition meant coming up with catchy slogans and so forth, and so to that end, the New York Central touted the 20th Century Limited as the most famous train in the world. Now, while it may not have actually been the most famous train in the world, it certainly was one of the most elegant, and passengers were literally given the red carpet treatment, and they enjoyed all the amenities you could imagine, including fine china in the dining car, secretarial services, and even an onboard barbershop. Now, for the privilege of riding on the train, passengers paid a fairly high price for the time. In the 1920s, the trip from New York to Chicago totaled just over $50 and could cost even more if you wanted a private compartment. Of course, all those expensive tickets made a lot of money for the New York Central. In 1928, its peak year, the 20th Century Limited pulled in $10 million and was believed to be the most profitable train in the world. Over the years, a variety of engines were used to pull the 20th Century Limited. The leg of the trip, both entering and exiting New York City, was always under electric power. Typically, they would use a box cab electric, and that was due to the fact that steam engines were not allowed within the city. But once the train got out of the city, they would switch out the electric engine for a steam engine. Now, in its early days, the steam engine used to pull the train was more or less a typical-looking steam engine. But by the mid-1930s, the train could be found being pulled by the famous Commodore Vanderbilt. And then, in 1938, the 20th Century Limited really hit its stride when it began to be pulled by the famous 464 Dreyfuss Hudson, like what you see here. The use of streamlined engines and trains was a very popular trend with many railroads in the 1930s, and it was basically a gimmick that they used to attract Depression-weary Americans back to rail travel, and the Dreyfuss Hudson was probably the most iconic of all of the streamlined engines. And of course, it gets its name because it was designed by famous American designer Henry Dreyfuss. Anyway, eventually steam power fell by the wayside, and so in 1945, the 20th Century Limited began to be pulled by EMD diesels, and it remained under diesel power until the train finally went out of service after years of decline in 1967, just before the merger of the New York Central and the Pennsy that would create the Penn Central. Now, as for the beautiful Dreyfuss Hudsons, all of them were eventually scrapped, and so unfortunately there are no examples around today, and that's a pity, because how cool would that be if one of these things was still around and could be restored and put back into service? That would be awesome. Okay, so that takes care of the history. Now let's talk about MTH's rendition of the Dreyfuss Hudson and the 20th Century Limited. So, the passenger set that you see here was offered by MTH in their 2014 Volume 1 catalog, and then these sets started showing up in stores in late 2014. Now, in the catalog, MTH offered a multitude of different configurations for the Dreyfuss Hudson. They offered 2 passenger sets. This is one of those 2. This one contains a 1940 type Dreyfuss Hudson with the skull and disc drivers and 4 matching passenger cars. The second passenger set is exactly the same, except it contains a 1938 type Dreyfuss Hudson that has the blue striping across the tender. Now, in addition to the passenger sets, MTH also offered 5 separate sale Dreyfuss Hudsons. 2 of those 5 are in the original 1938 configuration, which means they have some blue striping across the tender. Now, of those 2, one of them has these skull and disc drivers like you see here, and the other one has box pock disc drivers. They've got 2 in the 1940 configuration, which is what you see here, which does not have the blue striping. And again, one has the skull and disc drivers, and one has the box pock drivers. And then finally, they've got a really cool version that has the box pock drivers and a big 14-wheel tender. So they've certainly got a lot to choose from. Now, each of the 5 separate sale Dreyfuss Hudsons comes in either a high rail version, which is what you see here, which is meant for 3-rail O-scale, or a scale wheeled version, which is meant for 2-rail O-scale. Okay, let's start off with some stats and facts on this set. The length of the engine itself is right at 13.5 inches. The length of the tender is 10.25 inches. The combined length of the engine and the tender is 24.75 inches. The length of each of the 4 passenger cars is right at 17.5 inches. And the length of the entire set is right at 8 feet 5 inches. So there's a lot of train here. Let's talk about weight. The weight of the engine is 7 pounds 14 ounces. The weight of the tender is 4 pounds 4 ounces. So that gives us a combined weight of 12 pounds 2 ounces. The weight of each of the 4 passenger cars is right at 1 pound 13 ounces, give or take an ounce or 2 depending on the car. The engine has 2 pounds 4 ounces of pulling power, which is very good, and the minimum curve needed to operate this set is 0.42. On the inside, the engine is powered by 1 large flywheel motor. There's also a fan-driven smoke unit in the front of the engine for the smokestack, and then back in the tender are the electronics for MTH's ProtoSound 3.0. There are a few ways to operate this engine. The preferred method, of course, is to use MTH's digital command system, as that will give you access to all of the engine's advanced features. However, you can also run the engine conventionally with just a transformer and some track. Now, this engine is also equipped with a DCC receiver, and since DCC is not typically used to run 3-rail O-scale models, you may be wondering why MTH put it in there. Well, this engine is Protoscale 3.2 compatible. That means it can be converted to 2-rail operation, and since many 2-rail O-scalers do use DCC, that's why MTH put it in there. It's yet another example of how thoughtful and thorough MTH is when they design these models. Okay, what we're going to do now is go in for a closer look at the engine and the tender, and then after that we'll take a look at the 4 passenger cars. As we go in for a closer look, here's the pilot area. Now, because this is a streamlined engine, you're not going to see a ton of extra detailing on the exterior of the engine. But right here, we've got some nice cast-in steps on either side. We've got a beautiful New York Central logo plate here. We've got the beginnings of these nice fine wire handrails that run down either side of the boiler. And then we've got steps on either side as well. Right behind this panel, there is a scale coupler that swings out. Now, if I wasn't filming this video, I would turn the engine upside down to make it easier to get that panel off. But what I'm going to do here is take this little hook tool and come in behind it like this, and then just push, and it pops right off. And then, let me see if I can get the little scale coupler to pop out. Oh, there he goes. And there it is. Now, if you want to double head the engine, you can swap out that dummy scale coupler for a dummy O-gauge coupler that's also packaged with the engine when you buy it. Replacing that panel piece is a little easier than taking it off. All we have to do is fold the scale coupler back down, and then here is that panel piece. It's got metal clips on the back side that will hold it in place. And then on the front side, it's not a perfect square. The top is concave and the bottom is convex. And so we want the concave side on top. And so just pop it in place like that. As we swing around the side, we can get a good look at one of the two sets of cylinders. Looks really good. And here's a look at the drivers and all of the drive gear. This looks great. It's one of my favorite parts of this engine. It looks so slick, and it looks even better when the engine is in motion, especially at low speeds. And then up here under the shrouding, they've got some detailing up here. It's just really well done. Now, above the drivers, they've also got some ground lights. There's one right here that you can barely see on the video, and then there are two more up under the shrouding, and then there's three on the other side as well, and you'll see them in action when we start this thing up in just a few minutes. Back toward the firebox and under the cab, again, there's not a whole lot to see because of the streamlined shrouding, but we do have a very nicely detailed trailing truck. And then if you lift this up a little bit, you can see they've added some piping underneath here. It looks great. Moving up, here's that legendary nose on the front of the Dreyfuss Hudson, and really this is one of the most iconic boiler fronts of the steam era, in my opinion. This thing right here always kind of reminds me of a gladiator's helmet. Now, there's not a lot of detailing around here because of the streamlining, but we do have an operating headlight here in the middle. As we start to move down the side of the boiler, we've got some really nice cast-in detailing up here and around here. And then we've got a legible builder's plate here, and there's one on the other side as well. And then we've got the continuation of these wire handrails that go down either side of the boiler. Now, something that I want to point out is that a few weeks ago I read a post on the OGR forum where somebody was disappointed because it seems that lately MTH has been using a thinner gauge of wire for their handrails and grab irons and so forth. And I think that's true. They are using a thinner gauge of wire these days. If this was made maybe 10 years ago, I think this would have been a thicker gauge of wire, maybe something more along the lines of this throttle linkage down here. Heck, if this was a Lionel model, I think the wire handrails would be a thicker gauge of wire. And the poster was concerned that the use of the thinner gauge of wire might mean that MTH was being cheap, but I disagree with that. I don't think they're being cheap. I think they're adding more realism to the model because the thinner gauge of wire looks much more prototypical. And it seems that most people on the OGR forum agreed with me, and they thought it was a good thing as well. Now, yeah, the wire's a little more fragile because it's thinner, so you have to be a little more careful with it, but I think it's a good trade-off because ultimately it looks much more realistic. Anyway, moving on down, this is about the most add-on detailing you're going to find on this streamlined engine, and it looks great. As we get back toward the cab, we've got the continuation of the handrail, the throttle linkage, and this pipe down here. On the outside of the cab, there's a separately applied metal grab iron right up here. There are clear plastic inserts in the windows. On the inside of the cab, there are two hand-painted crew figures. There's a very detailed backhead. There's a red glow in the firebox when the engine is in operation. And there's also a cab light which automatically turns off when the engine starts moving. Here's a quick look at the other side of the engine. It looks pretty similar to the side you've already seen, but on this side we've got some nice hand-painted valves. Let's take a look at the top of the engine. Up front, we've got the smokestack, and there is a fan-driven smoke unit down in there. And of course, to load smoke fluid into the smoke unit, you simply pour the smoke fluid directly down the stack. Back behind the stack, we've got some nice cast-in details here. Moving back, we've got some nice hand-painted pop-off valves as well as a whistle. And then finally, back on top of the cab, there are 3 vents that open up like that. Here's a look at the back of the engine. Starting at the bottom, we've got the MTH so-called wireless drawbar, which allows the electronics in the tender to communicate with the electronics in the engine. And then up here, we've got the drop plate that allows the crew to get from the engine to the tender. Now, MTH is pretty consistent about putting these on all of their high-end steam engines. Lionel, not so much. Sometimes they do it and sometimes they don't. And it's always kind of aggravating when you get a brand new, beautiful Lionel steam engine, and then you've got this big gap between the engine and the tender because there's no drop plate. And so I always sort of imagine the firemen courageously leaping between the engine and the tender to fetch loads of coal or wood or what have you. Now, I actually have a friend who puts these drop plates on engines that don't have them. So one of these days, I'm going to have to look him up and have him fix my Lionel steam engines that don't have drop plates. But MTH, they do a great job with it, and it's even got the safety tread on it. Anyway, up here we've got plastic inserts in these windows, and then we've got a couple of separately applied metal grab irons, and again, these are using that thinner gauge of wire. It looks much better. And then you can see a little bit of the inside of the cab. You can see some of those nice gauges and so forth. It looks great. Here's a look at the gap between the engine and the tender. Now, it's a pretty big gap in my opinion, which is typical for O gauge. But what saves the day, again, is this drop plate. That's how it would look without a drop plate. It looks pretty ridiculous. But you swing it down, and all of a sudden, it looks much more realistic. Now, MTH makes a drawbar kit which contains shorter drawbars. Now, I've got one of those kits, but it's for Protosound 2 engines. I don't know if they've made the kits for Protosound 3 yet, but I want to find out because I'd like to try getting a shorter drawbar to try to draw the tender in just a little bit closer for a little more of a realistic look. Here's a look at the underside of the engine. There are 2 pickup rollers right here, and then 2 traction tires on the last set of drivers. Alright, that takes care of the engine. Now let's take a look at the tender. Well, as you can see, MTH did a great job on the tender. We've got this beautiful New York Central logo going across. And keep in mind that if I had bought the 1938 style Dreyfuss Hudson, it would have had a blue stripe going across as well. We've got some great rivet detail all over the place. There are separately applied metal grab irons on the corners. And then, if I lift this up because you can't see it very well, we've got some nicely detailed truck side frames. Here we have the front of the tender, and it's pretty typical for what you see on most O-scale tenders. We've got a lot of cast-in detailing. However, we do have a little outcropping of coal right here. And then we've also got safety tread on the deck and some nice steps down here. Let's check out the back of the tender. Starting at the bottom, we've got the proto coupler that can be thrown from the DCS remote. Then we've got some nice legible signage here on the outside. And then on the inside is where it starts to get cool because you can really tell that they built a streamlined shrouding over what would be an ordinary tender. So on the inside, you've got everything that a tender should have. A backup light, a separately applied metal ladder, some grab irons, some signage, and a road number. And if you look up here, you can see some light shining in. So let's go up top and see what that's all about. Here's what it looks like from above. The top of that ladder that you just saw is right here. And then underneath here, we've got some additional cast-in detailing that you can't see from this angle. And then right here is the water hatch, and underneath the water hatch is the master smoke volume control. Now, here's my favorite part of the tender, and that is the coal bin. You know, when they put the streamlined shrouding on, they didn't want a big pile of coal interfering with that streamlined look. So they put these flaps up here on the coal bin, and they fold up like that. And there's the coal load, and then they go back down, and you've got that nice streamlined look. And of course, the coal in there is real coal. Finally, here's a look at the underside of the tender. There are some add-on detail pieces here. The speaker for the sound system is right here under the rear truck. And then we've got a few controls. There's a switch to go from 3-rail to 2-rail operation. There's another switch to go from DCS to DCC operation. And then there's also a master volume control. Alright, that takes care of the engine. Now we're going to take a look at the 4 passenger cars that come with this set. And although they may not be 100% true to the real 20th Century Limited passenger cars, they are very nice nonetheless. Okay, so as I said, there are 4 cars included with the set. There's a baggage RPO car, like you see here. There's the Imperial Arch coach car. There's the Cascade Vale coach car. And then there's the Genesee River observation car. Now, when it comes to reviewing MTH passenger cars, I'm beginning to feel a little bit like a broken record, and that's because to date I've already reviewed maybe 4 or 5 or more sets of MTH passenger cars. And after a while, you start to realize that once you've seen 1 or 2 MTH passenger cars, you've kind of seen them all, except for maybe their European passenger cars. And that's because they are a very consistent product. MTH as a company is a model of consistency. And once they find something that works, they generally stick with it and don't change it unless there's a darn good reason. So MTH has been making these passenger cars for many years, and they haven't changed them because there's no reason to change them. They're great. They're not the most detailed, amazing high-end passenger cars in the world. They're just good, solid O-scale passenger cars, great paint job, great features, and great pricing, especially if you buy them with the set. And I've talked about this before, but when you buy the set, you get 4 passenger cars for an extra $100. That's $25 per car. You will not find a better deal than that anywhere. It's amazing. 4 passenger cars for $100. So it's a great deal for a great passenger car, a great set of passenger cars. So anyway, for those of you who already own MTH passenger cars, there's really not a whole lot I can tell you that you don't already know. But for those of you who are new to this, what I'm going to do is take a minute to show you the highlights of these cars, and then after that we'll wrap things up and take the set for a spin around the layout. Here's a look at one of the ends of one of these cars, and as you can see, it's very nicely done. We've got some steps down here, lots of separately applied details. There's a nice diaphragm. There's a little door in here. Now the door doesn't open, but it does have a clear plastic insert in the window. Any of the doors that are on the sides of the cars do open up like that, and they are sprung, so they'll snap back shut like that. And then as you can see, the detailing around the doors is very well done. The doors on both sides of the baggage RPO car open up, and on the 2 front doors, they've got these mail hooks. Pretty cool. And like all of the cars in this set, the baggage RPO car has interior lighting. All of these passenger cars have die-cast metal sprung trucks and operating couplers, and as you can see, the truck side frames look awesome. The interiors of these cars look great, and what you're seeing here is just a small sample of what you get. Here we have the back of the observation car. It looks great, and we've even got a nice little drum head. Here's a look at the underside of one of the passenger cars. There are 2 pickup rollers, 1 per truck. We've got some add-on steps, of course, and then there's a fair amount of molded-in detailing down here. Okay, the last thing we're going to do before we start this thing up is BF IMO, best feature in my opinion. Well, sometimes it's very easy to pick a best feature. If I'm reviewing a Vision Line engine, for example, that's very easy because they're loaded with new and innovative features. Or if an engine has a really nice horn or whistle that I've never heard before, that's easy. But with this set, it was a little more difficult because this is a great set, it's fantastic, but it doesn't have anything that's new or cutting edge or that's never been done before. And so for this one, I sort of had to go with my gut and pick the item that just stuck out for me personally. And that's the tender, oddly enough. I found that every time I walk by the engine, I start fiddling with the tender because it's got those flaps on the coal bin, and the back and the back top of the tender have so much depth and dimension. It just looks really cool. It's really one of the most beautiful tenders in my collection. And so for that reason, I'm going to pick the tender as the best feature of this set. Okay, let's go ahead and start the engine up. Now, I'm going to use the extended startup sequence, which makes use of some of the crew talk sounds, but if you don't like crew talk sounds, you don't have to use it.
We've got a schedule to keep. Let's get her steam. Clean out the ash pan. Grab a shovel and spread out that coal. Check on that water level, will you? Swing that spout over. Okay, that's enough. speed. I want to blow her down now. Clear? Clear.
Okay, first up, let's check out the whistle. Now, you can either do the standard whistle on this engine, or you can use the MTH quilling whistle. So first up, let's hear the standard whistle. Okay, now let's check out the quilling whistle. I am not the biggest fan of the MTH quilling whistle. It's nowhere near as good as Lionel's quilling whistle, and I think that's mainly because of the fact that the click wheel on the DCS remote is really not conducive to a good smooth quill, but it's okay, so let's give it a try. All right, next let's try out the bell. Now, you're going to hear most of the crew talk sounds for this engine when I do the PFA sequence in just a few minutes when we're running the train. But right now, I want to play for you two of the station announcements, because for me, they really take me back to my childhood, because when I was a kid and I had my dad's post-war Lionel set, he had a passenger station that was called the Noma station. It wasn't made by Lionel, it was made by another company, and it was called the Noma station, N-O-M-A. And inside the Noma station, there was a miniature record player, and when you pressed a button, it would play the record and you would hear station announcements, and it was really cool. And so when I hear the station announcements for this engine, it really takes me back to my childhood when I heard that Noma station. So let's go ahead and listen to them.
Now arriving from New York on track 1, train number 25, the 20th Century Limited. Now departing for Chicago on track 1, train number 25, the 20th Century Limited.
All right, let's go ahead and move it out.
Train number 25, the 20th Century Limited. This stop is Inglewood.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Welcome aboard. Ticketed passengers only. Let me help you with your baggage.
Now departing for Chicago on track 1, train number 25, the 20th Century Limited.
Welcome aboard. Step right this way. Watch your step. All aboard. I see the conductor's checked his watch again. Must be time to go. Conductor's giving us a highball signal. Let's get down the line. Okay, shut it off. I want to blow her down now. Clear? Clear. Take care. See you soon.
All right, that about wraps it up for this review. This is a beautiful set, and I, for one, am a big fan of it. It's got great MTH build quality, it runs great, it sounds great, and the best part of all is the price. The retail price on the engine by itself is right at $1,000, which is a good deal in itself. But for $100 more, you get the entire set, which is typical for MTH. So for $1,100, you get the engine and 4 great passenger cars. That is a great deal. And keep in mind that that's the retail price. If you go through a good MTH dealer, you can probably get a decent discount off that retail price. And as always, if you're looking for a good MTH dealer, try my favorite train store, which is Legacy Station. You can find them on the web at www.legacystation.com or give them a call at 770-339-7780. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm Eric Siegel, and I'll see you next time. To discuss this model or any other O-Gauge trains and to meet other O-Gauge modelers, check out the O-Gauge Railroading Magazine online forum at ogrforum.ogaugerr.com.